My name is Charlotte. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my life, I've been the person people describe with safe words. Steady, practical, not dramatic. I work with my hands and my head. I build things slowly. I keep records. I don't raise my voice. If you met me once at a family gathering, you might remember me as the quiet one who helped clear plates or fixed a printer without being asked, the one who listened more than she spoke. People tend to underestimate me because I don't show urgency. I don't rush to be understood. I don't correct every assumption. When something hurts, I usually take a walk before I take a stance. That has often made others comfortable deciding who I am for them. Reliable, flexible, present when needed, absent. Decisions are made. This story isn't about revenge, and it isn't about drama. It's about a long inheritance of land, of silence, of roles that get passed down without consent. It's about an ancestral home that carried more than walls and beams, and what happens when the people who think they own the narrative forget that memory has receipts. I want to be clear about what this story will and won't be. There are no villains twirling mustaches, no shouting matches, no sudden miracles. What unfolds happens quietly through paperwork, timing, restraint, and a refusal to disappear any further. If you're expecting a fiery confrontation, this won't be that. If you're interested in how power shifts when someone stops explaining themselves, you may recognize pieces of your own life here. This is a first-person account of how my relatives sold our ancestral home without telling me. By the time I arrived, the furniture was gone, and strangers had the keys. That moment is not the climax, it's the midpoint of understanding. The real story lives in what led up to it, and what followed after everyone assumed I would simply accept it. Over the next hour, I'll walk you through how I was seen, how small dismissals were normalized, and how silence, once a habit, became a choice. You'll hear about the leverage that isn't loud, the preparation no one notices, and the consequences that arrive without announcement. I'll share what it cost me emotionally, what it clarified morally, and what it gave back to me in the end. I'm not here to convince you that I was perfect or that they were cruel. I'm here to be precise, honest, calm, because sometimes justice doesn't need a spotlight. Sometimes it only needs someone to stop stepping out of the frame. As you listen, you might find yourself thinking of a place, a role, or a decision where you were quietly written out. If that's you, have you ever wondered what might change if you didn't rush to prove you belonged? To understand what happened, you have to understand who I was to my family before anything went wrong. Or rather, before anything was said to go wrong. I was the dependable one, the one who answered emails with full sentences, the one who remembered birthdays without needing reminders. At gatherings, I was often the person sitting slightly apart, listening to conversations instead of steering them. Not because I had nothing to say, but because no one ever seemed to pause long enough to notice if I did. In our family, there were roles that had been assigned decades before I was born. The loud ones led, the charming ones negotiated, the older ones decided. And then there were people like me, useful, capable, emotionally regulated, who filled in the gaps without disturbing the structure. I wasn't ignored in an obvious way. I was included just enough to be relied upon, but not enough to be consulted. When my grandmother was alive, the ancestral home was spoken about in collective language. Our house, our responsibility, our history. It was an old stone place just outside the city with uneven floors and doors that stuck in the winter. I spent summers there cataloging letters and photographs for her, labeling boxes, preserving what others considered clutter. She used to say I had the patience for things that last. After she passed, the language shifted. Slowly, subtly. Conversations about the house happened around me, not with me. Decisions were framed as updates. I was informed, never asked. At first, I assumed this was accidental. Families get busy. Grief rearranges priorities. I told myself it didn't matter because I trusted them. That trust was not dramatic. It was quiet. It looked like silence in group chats, like nodding during calls, like assuming that if something truly concerned me, someone would bring me in. I had no reason at the time to believe I was being excluded intentionally. I just believed I was peripheral. The truth is, invisibility doesn't announce itself. It settles in gradually until it feels normal to be overlooked. I didn't see myself as a victim. I saw myself as low maintenance, easy, someone who didn't complicate things. And families often reward that by taking it for granted. If you asked my relatives how they'd describe me back then, they would have said kind things. Responsible, calm. Charlotte doesn't mind. That phrase came up more than once. It wasn't meant unkindly, it was simply assumed. What no one seemed to notice, or perhaps no one considered relevant, was that I noticed everything. The dates that didn't quite line up, the tone changes, the way certain emails stopped including me in the thread history. I filed these details away without commentary, without confrontation, not because I was afraid, but because I was still trying to understand the shape of the room I was in. There's a particular loneliness that comes from being present, but not central, from caring deeply about something that others see as logistics. The house wasn't just property to me, it was context, it was lineage. It was proof that our family had existed somewhere long enough to leave marks in the walls. But I didn't say that out loud. I didn't want to sound sentimental or difficult. So I stayed as I was to them, the quiet one, the helpful one, the one who would adjust. And for a long time, that role felt manageable, almost honorable, until it didn't. The first time I felt something was wrong, it wasn't loud enough to justify a reaction. It came in the form of an email, brief, efficiently worded, sent late in the evening. It mentioned the house in passing, the way you might mention the weather or a delayed train. A sentence about moving forward with maintenance decisions, followed by a polite closing. No questions, no attachments, no invitation to weigh in. I remember rereading it several times, not because I didn't understand it, but because I was trying to locate myself inside it. I was named in the greeting, but not in the substance. It was clear that something had already been discussed, agreed upon, and now simply documented for my awareness. At the time, I told myself this was reasonable. I lived farther away. I was busy with work. Others were more involved. That explanation felt neat enough to accept, so I accepted it. I replied with a short acknowledgement. Thanks for the update. Let me know if you need anything from me. That was the first small cut, not the decision itself, but how easily I stepped aside from it. After that, there were little things. A phone call where someone referenced a conversation I hadn't been part of. A contractor's name dropped casually, as if I should already know it. When I asked clarifying questions, the answers came quickly but vaguely, like summaries rather than discussions. No one was unkind. That's what made it confusing. There was no confrontation to respond to, no sharp edge to push back against. Just a steady sense that I was arriving after conclusions had already been reached. At one point, I did raise a gentle concern. I asked whether there was a shared document or a meeting planned so everyone could stay aligned. The response was warm, almost reassuring. Don't worry, Charlotte. We've got it handled. There was a smile in the voice, a tone that suggested I was creating unnecessary complexity. That's the thing about the first small cut. It's often invisible to everyone but the person it lands on. To others, it's efficiency, momentum. To you, it's a message. Your input is optional. I remember sitting at my desk after that call, staring at my notebook. I'd written the house's address at the top of a page weeks earlier, planning to organize some of the old documents I still had. I closed the notebook instead. Not dramatically, just quietly. What stayed with me wasn't anger. It was a mild, persistent disorientation, like walking into a room you've been in all your life and realizing the furniture has been rearranged without you noticing when it happened. I watched how easily everyone else adapted to this new rhythm. Decisions are made quickly. Progress updates are shared confidently. There was a collective relief in moving on, in simplifying things. I didn't want to be the person who slowed that down, so I stayed observant. I listened more carefully. I noted who spoke and who summarized, who asked questions and who answered them. And I told myself that this was temporary, that once things settled, there would be space again. Looking back, that was the moment the pattern introduced itself, not with cruelty, but with convenience. And convenience, I would learn, can be far more decisive. What begins as an exception has a way of becoming a rule if no one names it. After that first email, the pattern didn't escalate. It solidified. Updates continued to arrive, already resolved. Timelines were shared after deadlines had passed. When I spoke, it was often to confirm details that had already been decided elsewhere. I became fluent in responding without interrupting momentum. At first, I framed this as maturity. I told myself that not every situation required my input, that trust meant letting others lead. I'd been raised to believe that harmony mattered more than insistence, and that being agreeable was a form of generosity. But something subtle was happening underneath that reasoning. Each time I accepted being informed instead of consulted, I was teaching them, and myself, what was acceptable. I noticed how my name disappeared from subject lines that once included me, how meetings were scheduled at times I couldn't attend, then summarized afterward as if that solved the exclusion. When I adjusted my schedule to join, the meeting would already be over. I started to anticipate this. I stopped blocking time for conversations that never came. I stopped offering suggestions unless asked directly. And when I was asked, it was usually about logistics, documents, dates, details, never direction. The disrespect wasn't loud enough to protest. It was quiet enough to rationalize. Others in the family didn't see it as disrespect at all. To them, things were moving smoothly. They were being efficient, practical, and decisive. And I was cooperating. From the outside, it looked like alignment. Inside, I was compartmentalizing. I told myself that my relationship to the house didn't need to be shared to be valid, that I could grieve privately, that I didn't need acknowledgement to maintain a connection. But normalization has a cost. It teaches your nervous system to lower expectations. It trains you to expect less consideration, less transparency, and less agency. And once that becomes familiar, it's hard to recognize when something crosses a line, because the line has already been moved. There was a moment I remember clearly. Someone referred to the house as an asset we need to offload eventually. The word offload landed heavily. I smiled, nodded, and said nothing. Later that night, I lay awake replaying it, trying to understand why it unsettled me so deeply. It wasn't just about the word, it was about the collective agreement that had formed without me. A shared understanding that the house was a problem to be solved, not a history to be stewarded. And in that agreement, my perspective had quietly become irrelevant. Still, I didn't speak up. I told myself that challenging this would make me emotional, difficult, sentimental, labels I had worked my whole life to avoid. So I normalized it. I adapted. I became even calmer, even more agreeable. I learned how to listen without reacting, how to absorb information without attachment. From the outside, I looked unbothered. Inside, something was recording everything. I didn't know yet what I would do with that information. I just knew I was done pretending it didn't matter. Roles don't always get announced. Sometimes they're handed to you gradually, reinforced by repetition until you realize you've been playing a part without ever auditioning for it. By the time I understood the role my family had assigned me, it was already well established. I was the reliable background presence, the one who would adapt, the one who wouldn't challenge the tone of the room. I was included when there was work to be done, when details needed checking, when something required patience and follow-through. I was excluded when direction was set, when authority was exercised, and when outcomes were decided. No one ever said Charlotte doesn't get a vote. They didn't need to. The structure made it clear. What struck me most wasn't malice, it was assumption. The assumption that I would continue to accept this positioning because I had. The assumption that my silence meant agreement, not restraint. The assumption that I valued peace over participation. In family conversations, I noticed how often decisions were framed as fates accompli. We've decided. It makes the most sense. Everyone agrees. I was included in that everyone, even when I hadn't been present. When I did express hesitation, it was met with gentle reassurance rather than engagement. You're overthinking it. Trust us. This is the practical choice. There was no space for nuance, no curiosity about why I might feel differently. I began to see that my role wasn't just passive, it was functional. My presence validated their process. If I, the careful one, the archivist, the person who cared about history, didn't object, then the decision felt cleaner, more legitimate. That realization was sobering. I thought about all the times I had been asked to review documents, confirm details, and organize files. How often my labor had been used to support outcomes I hadn't shaped. I had been mistaken for consent, and yet I still didn't confront them. Not because I lacked the words, but because I was starting to understand the terrain. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with one honest conversation. This was a system that benefited from my compliance. So instead of reacting, I observed more closely. I paid attention to who held information, who controlled timelines, and who spoke last in meetings. I noticed how urgency was used to bypass discussion, how practicality became a shield against accountability. I also noticed something else, how little anyone questioned my quietness. It had become so expected that my restraint was invisible. That invisibility, I realized, was not just a vulnerability. It was also a position. When you are not perceived as a threat, you are often given access. You are trusted with details others don't think to guard. You are overlooked in ways that can be painful, but also informative. I didn't change my behavior outwardly. I continued to be helpful, calm, responsive. But internally, something shifted. I stopped measuring my worth by how agreeable I was. I stopped assuming that being included later was better than being included now. I began to understand that the role I had been assigned was not the role I had to keep. The day something shifted didn't arrive with an argument or a revelation. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no decisive sentence that split my life into before and after. It arrived quietly, on an ordinary afternoon, while I was sorting through a box of documents I had kept from my grandmother's study. I hadn't planned to open that box. I was looking for something else entirely. An old notebook, I think, or a set of photographs someone had asked me about months earlier and then forgotten. The box was heavy, its corners softened by time. When I lifted the lid, the smell of paper and dust pulled me backward years before I had a chance to think. Inside were deeds, letters, handwritten notes, and copies of correspondence I didn't remember making. My handwriting, though, dates, marginal notes, questions I had written to myself long ago. I sat down on the floor and began to read, not with urgency, but with the slow attention I had always given to things that mattered. As the afternoon passed, a pattern emerged, one I hadn't consciously assembled before. I saw how often my grandmother had deferred to me for clarification, how frequently she had asked me to verify details about the house, the land boundaries, the arrangements that had been made decades earlier. I saw how much trust had lived in those exchanges. And then I saw the gap. There was a point in time where her handwriting stopped and other hands took over. Formal language, simplified explanations, decisions are summarized rather than discussed. The same shift I had felt in my own experience, but now preserved on paper. That was the moment I realized this wasn't personal in the way I had been interpreting it. It was procedural, generational, a pattern that repeated when someone was perceived as steady enough not to resist. Sitting there, I felt something settle in my chest, not anger, not grief, but clarity. I understood then that my silence had not protected me. It had simply made it easier to move around, and more importantly, I understood that continuing in that silence would mean agreeing to a future where my connection to the house and what it represented would be permanently defined by others. I didn't stand up and call anyone. I didn't write an email or make a list of demands. I closed the box carefully and placed it back on the shelf. What changed that day was internal. I stopped waiting to be included. I stopped assuming that consideration would arrive if I was patient enough. I stopped interpreting exclusion as neutrality. Instead, I began to think in terms of responsibility. To myself, to the truth of what I knew, to the history I had been trusted with before anyone else decided it was inconvenient. There was no vow, no dramatic resolve, just a quiet decision to pay closer attention and to choose my silence deliberately, rather than by default. That was the day something shifted. Not outwardly, but decisively. After that afternoon, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been habitual, something I slipped into without thinking, a way of smoothing over uncertainty. Now, it has become intentional, measured. I stopped speaking, not because I felt excluded, but because I was listening for different things. I noticed how often urgency was manufactured, how quickly decisions were framed as time-sensitive when they were anything but, how the phrase "we need to move fast" appeared whenever questions threatened to slow the process. Silence, in that context, gave me space to observe patterns rather than react to pressure. When updates came through, I read them closely, not for what they said, but for what they assumed. Who was copied, who wasn't, which documents were referenced without being attached, which phrases were repeated as if familiarity would substitute for consent. I responded politely, consistently. I never challenged the tone. I thanked people for keeping me informed. And because my behavior hadn't changed outwardly, no one suspected that my understanding had deepened. That was the advantage of being underestimated. My calm was read as compliance. My restraint is disinterest. I was still the same Charlotte they had always known. Helpful, unthreatening, easy to work around. What they didn't see was how much information moved through me now without friction, how details accumulated, how timelines overlapped, how contradictions quietly revealed themselves. I began to document things for myself. Not obsessively, just enough. Dates, names, phrases that felt deliberately vague. I wasn't building a case. I didn't yet know what I would need. But I was no longer letting things pass unrecorded. There was a moment when someone apologized for forgetting to loop me in earlier. I smiled and said it was fine, and it was. Not because it didn't matter, but because I no longer needed their inclusion to validate my position. Silence, when chosen, is different from silence imposed. It creates room. It unsettles people eventually. Not immediately, but over time. Because it doesn't reassure them the way they expect. My silence no longer smoothed things over. It simply existed. I could feel the shift in how conversations ended. Slightly less confident. Slightly more rushed, as if something unspoken lingered. Still, nothing outward changed. No one confronted me. No one adjusted their behavior. They had no reason to. From their perspective, everything was proceeding as planned. And in a way, it was. Because while they were moving quickly toward outcomes they assumed were inevitable, I was moving slowly toward understanding. And understanding, I would learn, creates its own leverage. What they never noticed was how much space their certainty gave me. Because once people decide you're not going to interfere, they stop managing what you see. They stop guarding their language. They assume your presence is neutral. And neutrality, in families like mine, is treated as absence. I began to notice how often information passed through me incidentally. A forwarded email meant for someone else. A document shared just for reference. A casual comment about dates that didn't quite align with what had been said before. None of it felt important on its own. Together they formed a map. I didn't announce that I was paying attention. I didn't ask sharper questions. I stayed exactly as I had been. pleasant, calm, responsive. The only difference was that I stopped forgetting. I revisited records I already knew well, land registry entries, probate language, old correspondence that referenced agreements in oblique ways. I compared versions of documents that were meant to feel identical, but weren't. Small omissions, reworded clauses, assumptions embedded in phrasing. This wasn't about catching anyone out, it was about understanding the structure I was standing in. I realized that much of what was being treated as settled was, in fact, provisional. Decisions had been made quickly, but not always correctly. Authority had been assumed rather than confirmed, and timelines had been accelerated in ways that left little room for scrutiny. The house, I learned, existed at the intersection of several incomplete conversations: legal, familial, historical. Each person involved understood only their part and assumed someone else had handled the rest. No one had. That realization didn't come with triumph, it came with a kind of quiet responsibility. I saw clearly that the narrative everyone was operating under was fragile. Not because it was wrong, necessarily, but because it hadn't been examined. I also saw how my earlier silence had positioned me perfectly for this moment. Because I had never objected, no one anticipated that I might. Because I had always been careful, my interest in detail seemed normal, expected, even. I took my time. I didn't rush to conclusions. I verified things twice, sometimes 3 times. I let weeks pass without acting, letting information settle into coherence. And still, no one noticed. They didn't notice the way I stopped offering reassurance. They didn't notice that my questions, when I asked them, were precise. They didn't notice that I no longer reacted emotionally to updates about the house. They assumed I had made peace with being peripheral. What they never considered was that I was no longer operating from the margins at all. I was simply working somewhere they didn't think to look. Preparation, I learned, doesn't announce itself. It looks like patience. It feels like waiting. And to those who underestimate you, it's indistinguishable from surrender and made about authority over the house. Assumptions that depended on timing, on interpretations of intent, and on the belief that no one would revisit older agreements closely. But those assumptions didn't fully hold when placed alongside the complete record. I remember the exact moment the realization settled. It wasn't excitement. It was relief, because for the first time in months, the confusion lifted. The sense of being quietly displaced gave way to understanding. I could see how the situation had unfolded, why decisions had been made the way they were, and where the blind spots lay. Most importantly, I understood my position within it. I had been treated as peripheral because I had been perceived as non-consequential, but the records told a different story. They showed continuity, responsibility, involvement that predated many of the recent decisions. What I held wasn't power in the dramatic sense. It was clarity, and clarity, I learned, is enough. I didn't tell anyone. Not because I was afraid of losing the advantage, but because I wanted to be sure of my understanding. I revisited everything again. I sought neutral confirmation where I could, quietly, without framing it as a challenge. Each confirmation reinforced the same conclusion. Things were not as simple as they had been presented, and simplicity had been used to move quickly past complexity that mattered. I sat there for a long time after that, hands folded, not thinking about what I would do next, but about what I wouldn't do. I wouldn't argue emotionally. I wouldn't expose anyone publicly. I wouldn't rush. There was no satisfaction in this moment, only a calm, steady awareness that the ground I was standing on was firmer than anyone realized. The reveal was private, and that was exactly how it needed to be. Once you see clearly, you can't unsee it. But clarity doesn't tell you what to do. It only shows you what's possible. I reached a point where several paths lay open to me. I could have confronted them immediately, laid out what I knew, forced a conversation they weren't prepared for. I could have stepped back entirely, let events unfold, and preserved my emotional distance. Or I could move quietly, allowing the process to continue while ensuring that reality, not assumption, sets the final terms. Each option carried consequences. Confrontation would have shifted the dynamic instantly, but it would also have invited defensiveness. Silence, total silence, would have preserved harmony at the cost of erasure. The third option required patience, precision, and the willingness to let others misunderstand me a little longer. I chose the irreversible one, not because it was the most satisfying, but because it was the most honest. I decided that I would no longer correct the narrative verbally. I would let documentation speak. I would let timing matter. I would let the system that had been used to bypass me also reveal its limits. This wasn't about outmaneuvering anyone. It was about aligning action with truth. I made a list, not of demands, but of steps. Small, quiet steps that didn't require permission. Clarifications, confirmations. Requests are framed as routine rather than oppositional. I didn't announce my intent. I didn't hint at what I knew. I also prepared myself emotionally for misunderstanding. I knew that by not explaining myself, I would appear distant, perhaps even indifferent. That was a cost I accepted. There's a particular kind of resolve that doesn't feel like courage in the moment. It feels like calm inevitability, like choosing to walk in one direction because turning back would mean betraying what you now understand. That was where I was. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. And once the decision was made, everything else became procedural. After the decision, my life didn't look any different from the outside. That was the point. I still answered messages with the same tone, still acknowledged updates, still appeared peripheral to the larger momentum everyone else believed was unstoppable. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed I stopped asking why and started asking how, but no one was watching that closely. I began with clarifications that sounded administrative, requests for copies for my records, questions about dates so I can update my files. Nothing confrontational, nothing suggested resistance. These were the kinds of requests I had always made, just now with a different internal orientation. When responses were slow, I waited. When they were vague, I asked for precision, politely, neutrally. I never framed anything as a disagreement. I framed it as alignment. At the same time, I took steps that didn't involve them at all. I consulted professionals quietly, not to escalate, but to confirm. I asked hypothetical questions. I described scenarios without naming people. I listened carefully to what was said and what wasn't. Each conversation reinforced the same conclusion. The process everyone assumed was complete was in fact incomplete. Certain steps had been skipped, certain authorities assumed, certain implications are overlooked. Still, I didn't interrupt. I allowed things to proceed because an interruption would have triggered urgency. And urgency, I had learned, was their most reliable defense. Letting things continue revealed gaps they could no longer correct without acknowledging them. There was a moment when someone mentioned that everything was basically done. I nodded, smiled, and made a note. That phrase, basically done, would matter later. Moving in silence required discipline. There were days when I wanted to speak, to clarify misunderstandings before they hardened. But I reminded myself that misunderstanding was already built into the structure. Correcting it prematurely would only restore the same imbalance. So I stayed quiet. I moved carefully. I let my actions be small enough not to register, but cumulative enough to matter. And still, no one noticed. They were too busy congratulating themselves on efficiency, on progress, on having finally resolved something that had felt complicated for too long. I watched from a position they had assigned me long ago. The background, the margin, the place where no one expects movement. What they didn't understand was that margins are where documents get footnotes. And footnotes, when read closely, change everything. The consequences didn't arrive with an announcement. They never do. At first, it was just a slight change in tone. Messages that used to sound confident began to carry qualifiers. Phrases like just checking and minor delay appeared where certainty had lived before. Nothing alarming, just enough to suggest that the path forward wasn't as smooth as expected. I didn't respond any differently. I acknowledged, thanked, and waited. Then came the questions. They weren't directed at me, not initially, but I heard about them in passing. A request for clarification that hadn't been anticipated. A response that took longer than usual. Someone else was asked to confirm something they had assumed was already confirmed. What struck me was how quickly discomfort spread once momentum slowed. Efficiency depends on the belief that everything essential has already been handled. When that belief wavers, so does confidence. Still, no one connected the shift to me. Why would they? I hadn't objected. I hadn't warned anyone. I hadn't even expressed concern. From their perspective, I remained exactly where I had always been. Quiet, cooperative, peripheral. But the system they were moving through was no longer cooperating. Deadlines slipped. Explanations grew longer. Someone used the phrase unexpected complication during a call, then quickly minimized it. I listened, said nothing. What I noticed most was how loss was felt before it was understood. There was a subtle frustration in their voices. Not anger yet, but unease. The kind that comes from realizing something you assumed was settled isn't. They began to retrace their steps, to revisit decisions, to ask questions that, weeks earlier, would have felt unnecessary. And with each revisit, the absence of certain confirmations became more obvious. I watched as they tried to solve the problem the way they always had, by moving faster, by narrowing the conversation, by assuming alignment. But speed no longer helped. The issue wasn't pace, it was a foundation. At one point, someone remarked that this shouldn't be this complicated. I almost smiled, not out of satisfaction, but recognition. Complexity doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. It waits. The consequences were not punitive. They were structural, and structures, once stressed, reveal exactly where they were weak. Still, I remained silent because this wasn't the moment for explanation. It was the moment for experience, for the realization to arrive organically without me having to carry it into the room. And it did, slowly, unevenly, but inevitably. By the time they truly realized something was wrong, the language had changed completely. The certainty was gone. The short, confident statements about things being handled or basically finished disappeared. In their place came longer sentences, softer edges, and a growing reliance on conditional phrases. Possibly, it seems, we may need to revisit. It was the sound of a system beginning to doubt itself. The urgency that followed was no longer strategic, it was reactive. Questions started circling back to details that had previously been brushed aside. Points once dismissed as minor suddenly became obstacles. And what stood out most to me wasn't what they were asking, but who they were asking. At first, they didn't come to me directly. I heard about conversations happening around me, calls, emails, exchanges between people trying to piece things together. The system spun in circles, searching for clarity anywhere except the place it had existed from the beginning. Then gradually they turned toward me, not with acknowledgement, with disguised questions. Do you remember what your grandmother said about this back then? You still have some of the old documents, right? Does this timeline seem accurate to you? They sounded casual, almost nostalgic, as if they were simply drawing on memory, not realizing they were reaching for something they had ignored. I answered each question calmly, precisely. I didn't add commentary. I didn't connect the implications for them. I didn't step into the role of interpreter or mediator. What they needed at that moment wasn't information. They needed reassurance. And that was something I no longer offered automatically. Before, I would have softened uncertainty with tone. I would have filled gaps with explanations, made anxiety smaller by making things feel manageable. I had once believed that was kindness. But kindness, when expected rather than chosen, becomes an obligation. This time I didn't do that. When they asked, I answered. When they hesitated, I didn't rush to fill the silence. When they spoke in circles, I didn't help them find shortcuts. That difference unsettled them. I could feel it in the way conversations stretched longer than intended, in the unfamiliar pauses, in the way some questions were repeated, as if they hoped I might instinctively complete the thought for them. I didn't. Then came a call that hadn't been scheduled far in advance. The voice on the other end was no longer steady, not panicked, but off rhythm. They spoke quickly, offering explanations before I'd said anything at all. We've uncovered a few things we didn't expect. This really shouldn't be this complicated. If we had known earlier, the last sentence was quieter, almost a sigh, less an observation than a regret. I didn't correct it, because the truth was we had known earlier, or at least we could have. The information had never been hidden. It had simply been inconvenient. And inconvenience in this family had always been reason enough to move past something without addressing it. Now that same convenience had collapsed into limitation. Timelines were no longer flexible. Decisions made in haste had become immovable. Commitments that once felt efficient now constrained us. Every available option. Someone suggested pausing everything and regrouping. Another voice immediately resisted, not because it wasn't necessary, but because it was too late to pause without admitting error. That was the cost of moving quickly without listening. I listened to all of it without interrupting. What struck me most wasn't the disorder. It was what they regretted. They didn't regret excluding me. They didn't regret sidelining my perspective. They regretted losing options. They regretted that. Had they known sooner, they could have handled it differently, which meant faster, cleaner, with less resistance. Not fairer, not more accurate, just easier. And that's when I understood something quietly but completely. Even if I had spoken up earlier, in the version of myself they expected, the outcome likely wouldn't have changed. Because the problem had never been a lack of information. It was a lack of willingness to slow down for anything that complicated the plan. The attention I received now came too late to correct the structure. It was just enough to clarify the consequences. They began speaking to me with more care, less dismissive, but not quite respectful either, more cautious. As if they had finally realized I hadn't been behind them at all. I had simply been standing still. No direct apology came, only vague acknowledgments that communication could have been better. No one named the obvious truth, that I had been excluded from decisions that directly affected me. I no longer needed them to, because by then, the outcome was no longer dependent on goodwill or recognition. It had already been shaped by a chain of actions taken under false certainty. Everything had moved too far to be neatly fixed, not because I refused to help, but because some misalignments can only be corrected when people are willing to admit the old way of doing things was flawed from the start. And that willingness had never been there. The confrontation, when it finally happened, did not arrive the way people expect confrontations to arrive. There was no argument waiting at the door, no tension crackling in the air, no sense that something dramatic was about to unfold. It was scheduled as a check-in, a neutral phrase that suggests alignment rather than reckoning. the kind of meeting people call when they feel control slipping and want to restore it quietly. I arrived on time. I brought nothing with me except my notebook. Not as evidence, but as habit. I didn't feel nervous. By then, nervousness would have implied uncertainty, and I had none. They spoke first, carefully, slowly, as if choosing the right tone might stabilize the situation. They summarized what had happened so far, how things had become more complicated than anticipated, and how certain assumptions hadn't held up under scrutiny. The language was cautious, almost rehearsed, designed to sound transparent without admitting fault. I listened without interrupting. There were moments where they paused, leaving space for me to respond emotionally, to reassure them, to soften the moment, to say it's okay, we'll figure it out. I recognized those pauses immediately. I had filled them with my entire life. This time I didn't. When they finally asked for my thoughts, I didn't begin with feelings. I didn't describe how it had been for me. I didn't recount the history of being left out. That story, I knew, would only invite debate. Instead, I spoke in facts. I clarified timelines. I referenced documents. I explained context where it was necessary and stopped where it wasn't. I didn't rush. I didn't emphasize. I didn't soften my delivery to make it more palatable. I spoke the same way I always had. Measured, precise, unembellished. The shift in the room was immediate. They realized then that this wasn't new information to me, that I hadn't just caught up, that I had been aware for some time, quietly, thoroughly, without signaling it. One of them asked, not accusingly, but with genuine confusion, "Why didn't you say something earlier?" The question wasn't hostile. It was disoriented, as if they were trying to locate the moment where they believed control had slipped and couldn't quite find it. I answered honestly. I wasn't asked. I didn't say it defensively. I didn't add an explanation. I didn't expand on it. I let the sentence stand exactly as it was. It landed harder than any accusation could have, because it reframed the entire situation. It wasn't about my silence being passive or strategic. It was about their assumption that silence meant agreement, not restraint. After that, the pace of the conversation changed. People spoke more slowly. They stopped interrupting. Questions became more careful, more specific. The confidence that had driven earlier decisions gave way to something closer to recalibration. No one argued with me. There was nothing to argue against. Facts don't escalate, they settle. I noticed how often they glanced at one another before responding, how explanations are shortened, how the room grew quieter, not with tension, but with recognition. I didn't demand accountability. I didn't ask for apologies. I didn't need to. By that point, the structure had already shifted. The leverage wasn't in what I said. It was in what no longer needed to be said. There was an unspoken realization that the version of me they had relied on, the accommodating presence, the background stabilizer, had never been uninformed, only unheard. The meeting ended without resolution. No clear next steps were outlined. No attempt was made to restore the old dynamic. That too was telling. I gathered my notebook, thanked them for the conversation, and left. No one stopped me. No one followed up immediately. The confrontation had happened without heat, without spectacle, without triumph. And that was exactly why it worked. I am not the person I was before all of this happened, but I am also not someone reshaped by resentment. What changed wasn't my nature. It was my relationship to myself. Before, I believed that restraint was synonymous with maturity, that staying calm meant staying agreeable. That if I were patient enough, considerate enough, eventually I would be included without having to ask. I thought dignity came from being low impact. Now I understand that dignity comes from clarity. I didn't become louder after everything settled. I didn't become harder or more guarded. What changed was something quieter and more fundamental. I stopped waiting for permission to take myself seriously. People interact with me differently now. Not dramatically. No one announced a shift. No one apologized outright. But there is a noticeable care in how decisions are framed around me. Fewer assumptions, fewer summaries are presented as conclusions. A pause, sometimes brief, sometimes awkward, where my presence is acknowledged as consequential. I don't correct the past. I don't revisit old conversations to reframe them. That would require energy I no longer spend on explanations that come too late to matter. What I carry forward instead is discernment. I still value calm. I still move slowly. I still listen more than I speak. But my silence no longer comes from accommodation. It comes from choice. From knowing that I don't need to announce my understanding for it to be real. I also no longer confuse being useful with being valued. For much of my life, I was trusted with work, but not with direction, with details, but not with decisions. I accepted that as a natural division of roles. Now I see it for what it was, a convenience others benefited from more than I did. That doesn't make me angry. It makes me precise. I am careful about where I invest my steadiness now, about who gets my follow-through, about which spaces deserve my patience and which ones simply expect it. The house what it represented, what it revealed, taught me something I carry into every part of my life now. That history doesn't disappear just because someone wants to simplify the present. And neither does truth. I no longer try to be palatable. I try to be accurate. That doesn't mean I confront people unnecessarily. It means I don't shrink my understanding to make others comfortable. It means I allow silence to do its work without rushing to soften its edges. When I look back, I don't see myself as naive. I see someone who was conditioned to equate harmony with safety. Someone who believed that being easy to work with would protect her place. Now I know better. My place doesn't come from being adaptable. It comes from being grounded, from trusting what I see, from documenting what matters, from knowing that restraint is powerful only when it is freely chosen. Who I am now is not someone waiting at the edge of the room. I am someone who knows exactly where she stands and is no longer willing to step aside just to make things easier for people who never asked whether it was fair. There is a particular kind of ending that doesn't feel like an ending at all. Nothing closes neatly. No one delivers a final speech. Life simply reorganizes itself around what has been revealed, and you step into that new shape quietly, without asking for permission. That's how this story ends. Not with victory, not with punishment, and not with reconciliation performed for comfort. It ends with alignment. For a long time, I thought closure required acknowledgement from others, an apology, a confession, some clear admission that what happened was wrong. I believed that without those things, the experience would remain unfinished, unresolved. I don't believe that anymore. Closure, I've learned, isn't something other people give you. It's something you allow yourself once you stop negotiating with the version of events that excluded you. What happened with the house was never just about property. It was about authorship, about who gets to define what matters, whose memory counts, and whose silence is mistaken for consent. The house simply made that dynamic visible in a way nothing else had. When my relatives sold our ancestral home without telling me, and I arrived to find the furniture gone and strangers holding the keys, it could have been framed as betrayal. And maybe, from the outside, that's what it looks like. But from where I stand now, it looks like inevitability. Not because it had to happen, but because no one was willing to slow down long enough to ask who needed to be present for the decision to be legitimate. Convenience replaced care, speed replaced fairness, and silence, mine, was misread as approval. What matters is not that I was excluded. What matters is that I stopped excluding myself. I didn't reclaim my place by demanding it. I reclaimed it by refusing to disappear any further, by trusting my understanding, even when it wasn't mirrored back to me, by letting truth work through systems rather than through arguments. There's a temptation, in stories like this, to frame the ending as empowerment through dominance, to suggest that strength only counts when it's visible, confrontational, unmistakable. But that hasn't been my experience. The most powerful moment in this entire story wasn't the confrontation. It wasn't the reveal. It wasn't even the consequences. It was the moment I realized I didn't need to be louder to be real. That realization changed how I moved through the world. I no longer rushed to clarify myself. I no longer preemptively soften my boundaries. I no longer assume that being agreeable is the same as being good. And perhaps most importantly, I no longer confuse access with authority. You can be invited into a room and still be unheard. You can be trusted with labor and still be excluded from meaning. You can be praised for being easy while being quietly erased. Recognizing that doesn't make you cynical. It makes you awake. If there is a moral in this story, and I think there is, it's this. Silence is not weakness, but silence without choice will always cost you something. Quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about orientation. It's about knowing where you stand, even when others pretend you're standing somewhere else. It's about allowing consequences to unfold without rushing to manage everyone else's comfort. It's about refusing to explain yourself to people who never made space to listen. I don't carry bitterness from this experience. Bitterness requires fixation, and I've moved past that. What I carry instead is precision, a sharper sense of when to engage, when to document, and when to step back and let systems reveal themselves. I also carry compassion, for myself, first and foremost. I understand now why I stayed quiet for so long, why I believed patience would protect me, why I thought being indispensable would make me irreplaceable. Those beliefs didn't make me foolish. They made me human, and letting go of them didn't require anger. It required honesty. This story may sound specific, one family, one house, one sequence of events, but I know it isn't unique. Dynamics like this repeat everywhere, in families, workplaces, friendships, and institutions, wherever someone is relied upon but not respected, wherever calm is mistaken for consent. If you recognize yourself anywhere in this, if you've ever been the one who noticed everything and said nothing, I want you to know this. Your awareness is not wasted, your restraint is not invisible, and your silence, when chosen, can become a position rather than a disappearance. You don't have to explode to matter. You don't have to perform outrage to be justified. And you don't have to wait for permission to take yourself seriously. Sometimes the most honest response is to stop explaining and let the truth stand on its own. Before I end, I want to leave you with one question, not to provoke judgment, but reflection. Have you ever stayed quiet in a situation where you were being written out, believing that patience would protect you? And if so, what do you think might change if your silence became a choice instead of a habit? I'd really like to hear your thoughts.
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.